This talk will focus upon the impact of family violence on children and what happens when they're exposed to violence throughout the different stages of their lives. Most of the material in this presentation comes from sources outside of the textbooks and other assigned readings in the course, and so this is intended to be supplemental information that will help you to better understand what goes on with kids. This is presented in connection with our learning unit on the maltreatment of children, and this involves more the emotional maltreatment that occurs to children when they're exposed to domestic violence in the home. Carol Peterson does talk some about some of the hard facts in her chapter on exposure to domestic violence for children. 30 million children are exposed to domestic violence before the age of 17. 60% of children in America are exposed to violence, crime, or abuse in their homes, schools, or communities. And in every year, 1 in 15 children are exposed to intimate partner violence, and 90% of those children are eyewitnesses to that violence. Children in domestic violence homes are abused or seriously neglected by their caregivers at a rate 1,500% higher than the national average. And more than half of adults, almost 2/3 of adults who abuse their partner, are also involved in either the physical or sexual abuse of their children, according to Dr. Peterson. The children who witness violence experience all sorts of different things, both immediately as well as later in their lives, including mood and anxiety disorders, depression, fear, even guilt, some regression in their developmental milestones, learning disabilities, poor school performance and truancy, aggressiveness themselves, difficulty forming relationships and maintaining those relationships in a healthy fashion, also some serious substance abuse at different times in their lives, and many other kinds of problems surface. Now, most of you are familiar with the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study. This is a study that was conducted by Kaiser Permanente among adults who were employed and were receiving health insurance through their organization. Now, these are adults rather, who are mostly middle class, mostly white, working full-time, and not generally considered to be at risk. These are people who leave for work in the morning and come home every night, are raising families and paying their bills, getting along quite well in the world and are pretty well adjusted. And yet what Kaiser Permanente found was that among those individuals who experienced these adverse childhood experiences, there were a number of complaints that resulted in the use of their services in the healthcare program that the employees were enrolled in. What this shows is living through those experiences in childhood that are considered to be adverse sets up a continuum of effects that needs to be interrupted because the impact of those experiences continue well into adulthood. And mind you, these are individuals, again, who have been functioning fairly successfully in society, and you can consider them generally not to be at risk, but other populations are considered to be even more at risk. We want to take a moment to take a look at the building blocks of the brain. This is information that was supplied by Linda Chamberlain, who is an epidemiologist who resides in Homer, Alaska with her husband. And she specializes in brain development and also the effects of exposure to violence on children. If you ever have an opportunity to hear her present or to attend a training session led by her, I strongly encourage you to do so. She's just a wealth of information. And Alaska is very fortunate to have her right there and available to you. So this demonstrates a little bit about, kind of in simple terms, how the brain is organized from the least complex on the bottom to the most complex on the top. So on the left-hand side, you see the various functions that the brain provides for us as we go about our daily living. And on the right-hand side, you see the primary purpose of each section of the brain, the 4 sections of the brain, as is described here at least, from very basic survival instincts all the way up to the higher functions of the brain, such as logic and conscience, our superego, so to speak. The brain focuses on survival first of all. That's the lower level functions, and so it's a given that really we must feel safe, nurtured, and stimulated before we can process things on a higher level. The more time we spend in the cortex, which is our intellectual capacities, that's the higher levels of the brain, the better off we are. The prefrontal cortex calms the rapid response system in the amygdala when threats are insignificant. So the cortex is really functioning to help us stay calm when we're presented with relatively insignificant threats. Younger children, though, don't have that prefrontal cortex developed as of yet, so they react much more strongly to violent situations than older children and adults do. And actually, there have been studies demonstrating that physical changes actually occur to the brain and the brain chemistry when children live in a chronically threatening environment. This is a key point that we need to keep in mind as we think about the impact of domestic violence on children. Oftentimes, when we've talked to child protection workers about domestic violence, one of the issues that they're exploring when they make their home visits is whether or not the children were exposed to that violence. And sometimes workers will say the children wasn't aware of the violence occurring because they were asleep in the next room or something along those lines, when in fact, most of the time, they're very much aware of it. They're not necessarily asleep, especially if there's a lot of noise going on. And there's even situations where it's been demonstrated that infants in a crib a few rooms away, now infants, you really wouldn't think are aware that much of what's happening, but that they're keenly aware of what's going on and are impacted by violence elsewhere in their home. And so we come to the conclusion that children really know, even if they don't see it or witness it. It's the chaos of the environment that hurts them most. At times, they've been known to do something to prompt the violence even, because what this does is it makes it more predictable for them. So sometimes older children who carry on a lot and who seem to engage in those behaviors that I think I mentioned at one point we used to call victim-provoked abuse in the olden days. Those children a lot of times are really trying to provoke the violence because they can feel it coming on. They prompt it, and it's more predictable for them and maybe more in their control. Babies in violent homes oftentimes will exhibit different kinds of behaviors or responses to individuals that are a sign of trouble. There is the condition known as a frozen or inhibited babies, where they really don't connect with the adults around them. And you may have run into this sometimes, where children generally will respond to gentle words and soothing tones and smiles and those kinds of things. But there are some babies that you'll encounter in your home visits who just don't respond at all to you. And that sometimes is an indication of children who have been exposed to violence. They don't reach out. Sometimes they cry a lot, and they're very, very difficult to soothe when they do cry. We'll have a lot of eating and sleeping problems. So when you're out on a home visit and you run into this kind of situation, this is perhaps a red flag for you about the possibility of violence in the home. Children in violent homes essentially dwell in their lower brains. That's the survival area, that fight or flight area of the brain. The traits that help these children to survive in these kinds of unpredictable situations are also the same traits that make it very impossible for them to function well in the classroom. So the school is demanding more activity in the cortex, in the higher levels of the brain, and yet because of their constant exposure to violence and perhaps also their worry, even when they're not in that environment directly, because of the fact that they're functioning in these lower areas of the brain a lot, they're not processing things in their higher levels, and so these children oftentimes do poorly in school. They also tend to be very vigilant. They're constantly scanning the environment around them for some signs of danger, even again if they're not around those individuals who have been violent in their lives directly. They're still in that part of the brain where they're staying on guard and watching against possible dangers. A lot of times this is confused for other conditions such as attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. And again, that's another thing. This is ADHD, I think I've mentioned elsewhere, oftentimes is confused with other issues going on in children's lives, and just need to be very, very careful before we endorse the use of medications for attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. Ensure that we have really ruled out other possibilities before we do that. Certainly you can imagine the problems that medication can cause if the medication is being prescribed inappropriately. So these kids a lot of times will be more impulsive, kind of more on edge and at the ready, and really less able to get into the thinking brain that teachers want in school. And so there's a lot of performance issues in school, and sometimes there are behavioral issues as well. Again, as I mentioned, the brain structure itself is sometimes physically changed by exposure to violence, by repeated exposure in particular. So we're not talking about one necessarily traumatic episode, but kind of environment where there's a constant kind of violent, traumatic experiences going on around them. There are more studies, PET scans, that have demonstrated the differences in the brain structure of children from violent homes as opposed to those growing up in more peaceful and more normal home situations. This, of course, affects their capacity to learn. They're very keyed into nonverbal cues, so words are much less important to them than what they are reading in other people. And being stuck more in their lower brain, if you're in a school environment, these children are more likely to be able to learn better in experience-based learning environments. This is just something for you to think about if you have children who have come from chronically abusive or chronically violent situations, that the learning program may need to be modified to help them learn better. Every new experience develops a blueprint in the brain. And when we're young, especially very young, we don't have words yet formed that we can associate with things that are going on around us. And this may be one reason why it is we really don't remember a lot of things from early childhood, is because we don't really have a place to put it in a sense that we can access it later. We don't have words to attach to events and to things around us. We just kind of more experience them. And so the conscious memory, our ability to be able to access memories in our very early years, are very seriously impeded because of that. That doesn't mean that we don't remember things. Those experiences are there, but being able to access it is pretty much impossible as we get older. And so these earliest experiences are really, they're the building blocks for the rest of the life, for our brain and for other areas of our lives. And so you can see why it's important that very young children not be exposed to violence in a chronic sense. Also, the younger the child, the more sponge-like the brain is. That is, that they essentially absorb pretty much everything around them, and it stays in there. And so young children are thus more vulnerable to trauma than older children. And this does include that infant in the crib who you wouldn't think doesn't understand what's going on. They may not understand it, but they're responding to it. The brain develops from the bottom to the top. If you think back to that building blocks of the brain that I showed you some slides back, from the basic survival kind of areas to the higher cognitions, from the bottom to the top and from the inside out, the parts of the brain on the top, the cortex, depend upon the healthy development of the lower brain areas as well. Those kids that live in violent homes tend to reside in their survival brain, and so their higher level brain functions are shut down and just don't develop nearly as much as children who are growing up in more normalized environments. Remember, we don't have words if we're experiencing these things very early in our lives. And so children a lot of times can't articulate about the violence. So what we see instead is, instead of being able to talk about it, what we see is that the stress that they experience manifests itself through things such as sleep problems and anxiety and that kind of thing. Again, very focused on survival. They're going to have very difficult time bonding with others, connecting to others, because that whole trust versus mistrust process is going on is impeded by the experiences that are going on around them. And these are the kids that are going to be seen as very difficult and defiant in school. They're going to have more problems in the classroom. They're going to act out. They're not going to learn very well with traditional teaching methods. And there's also a higher level of mental health problems evident in children who witness violence than among those who were a victim of direct abuse. This is significant because why we're talking about direct abuse, I mean, we're talking about kids who are physically abused themselves, and this suggests to me that the emotional scarring that goes on in the violent environment around the child is sometimes more harmful to them even than physical abuse itself. Dr. Chamberlain felt that what really happens is the babies have a tendency to absorb the states of things around them. So again, they absorb the violence and the environment, and they also absorb the parents' internal states. And so if you're thinking about one thing, maybe an explosive individual interacting with the child, but also another person who is suffering from being the victim of abuse on an ongoing basis, you can imagine then that the emotional states of the adults that are interacting with the baby are also going to be very troubled. And so Dr. Chamberlain said the brain becomes what the child is exposed to. So if you have an emotionally cold or distant parent, the baby's going to respond in a similar way. The baby's brain is going to develop in such a way. Frustration, anger, sadness, depression, kindness, all those kinds of things will be reflected in the baby's development. In many respects, the brain is a mirror to the child's experiences. When parents are responsive to children, when they cry or whatever, that people talk about, you're spoiling your child. Good attentive caregiving is anything but spoiling a child. It's really building the ability of that child for healthy self-regulation later in life. We talk a little bit here for the remaining few slides about how children respond to violence in the context of their development, and we'll look at each of these 5 areas here, these 5 life stages. The infant up to 18 months, you can see here the kinds of things that are expected to occur during normal development with an infant is that the infant establishes the basis for a secure attachment with caregivers. And when that attachment is disturbed early in life, that really does result in a lot of difficulties later in life that are become very pervasive. And there are theories, if you look at it from the psychological theories about personality disorders, there are beliefs, for instance, that the borderline personality disorder develops from a disturbance in attachments very early in life and most likely at this stage. And there are other theories as well that place a lot of emphasis upon the importance of attachment, secure attachment developing at this stage. Now, that's different from insecure attachment, that anxious attachment sometimes that develops when children experience rejection or experience violence and anger. Sometimes they'll attach to the parent in a kind of a clinging fashion. It is an anxious attachment. This is very different from a healthy attachment where a child develops an association with the adults around them in a secure way. So this is one of the key things that happens in the early stages of development for infants. They become dependent on their caregiver for protection, for nurturance, a sense of safety, all of this brought about by consistency of their caregivers. They have a very limited capacity at this age to cope with environmental stress. Again, a key factor in this discussion today. And when children at this stage are exposed to violence, what you tend to see, again, because they're not really able to verbalize much of what's going on, they see disturbances of sleeping and eating. They're resistant to being soothed, a lot of crying, irritability. Among toddlers, what the normal development at this stage, what's going on is the age of the terrible twos. And what this tells you is that the toddler is developing an understanding of the self as separate from mother and separate from father, so that the toddler will test limits and test his or her own resources, his or her own ability to impact the environment around them. So it's sort of a normal struggle for power and control, the terrible twos. Parents learn to say no a lot with the terrible twos, and children oftentimes ignore that and continue to defy the parent. That's a typical part of development at this stage. But they do look to their caregivers for cues, and they seek the company of trusted adults when they have some anxieties and things they're worried about. And of course, during this period of time, their capacities for physical movement, for thinking, for language, emotional expression, those kinds of things also increase during this period of time. But for those children exposed to violence, there's a disruption that they experience of that expectation that they should have, that the caregivers are going to protect. So again, this leads to attachment problems. Eating and sleeping, again, is sort of one of those areas where you can really look for young children to see how well adjusted they are. The eating and sleeping being disrupted. They may seem overly active or agitated, or on the other hand, overly passive, anything kind of outside the norm. At times, you'll see developmental regression, so that kids who might have been toilet trained, for instance, lose that capacity. Now, this, development isn't a straight line up. It is a kind of more of a circular kind of a up and down, up and down, up and down, but always getting better as time goes on. You can expect 2 steps forward, 1 step back as a normal part of development. But when we talk about developmental regression here, we're talking about something that is more pronounced than that, so that, again, toilet training, language, those kinds of skills, they may lose when they're exposed to violence on an ongoing basis. And also the terrible twos may become a much, much bigger struggle than it would be otherwise. For the preschool children aged 4 and up, this is when the period of play really becomes their area for expressing of their ideas and feelings. If you've got a young child in treatment, you don't really have talk therapy with them. Although they have language and they have some ability to process what's going on, they don't have those higher levels of reasoning and logic that a lot of times are key to success in talk therapy. So what you do with younger children when you're working with them in a therapeutic setting is generally play therapy of one time or another. It might be sand tray work or dollhouse work or those kinds of things, and because they express themselves through their play. And a good person who's trained in play therapy will be able to see what the child is acting out and perhaps help them learn to verbalize that and express what's going on a little bit. But this isn't a therapy class, and so we'll leave that at that. They have a higher level cognitive, language, physical capacities. They are better able to differentiate reality from fantasy, but keep in mind, they still sometimes have difficulty with that. I remember a little girl that I worked with one time who used to talk about watching horror movies with her mom and dad when she was just a toddler. And to her, it was just as real as anything that might be happening in front of her. And so it's one of those things you want to keep in mind, that children sometimes can't separate the two. And they also have a capacity to begin to interact with two or more people at one time. That isn't just a one-to-one interaction with others. Their social skills develop now where, actually can have a triadic relationship. But in an environment with chronic violence, again, possibly developmental regression. So here you'll see difficulties in separation. Some of those higher level developmental stages that they had already worked through, that they wind up regressing to again. Sleep disturbances, nightmares, having temper tantrums or being generally fearful. Conflicts over identification and loyalty conflicts also may be the result of exposure to violence. For those kids in school, this is really a time when they break away from their primary caregivers and their family, and their social network expands remarkably as they begin to interact with individuals from other children, from other families, with other values and other experiences themselves. So you can imagine the world opens up to kids when they start going to school. And so they're less reliant upon cues from their caregivers. They're much more independent. Their capacities, of course, have increased dramatically as they interact with teachers and other adults as well as other children in a school setting. They're more aware of themselves and their environment. And this is an age where kids are often engaging in cooperative play. They learn how to get along with others, how to negotiate, all those kinds of things that you learn when you interact with peers, when you're not in a relationship where one person has more power than you. Very, very important things that go on at this stage. This increased interaction with peers and adults outside the family brings about just a remarkable change in their world. For kids that have been exposed to violence, there's likely going to be school difficulties because they're not really able to concentrate as well. They might be worried about the parent that is the victim in the home. They may not want to go to school because they think that their presence there may protect that parent from harm from the abuser itself. That they just may be worried, and that may be one reason why they don't want to be in school or why they don't do well. But again, they're probably functioning in that lower section of the brain as well, and so concentrating on classwork, sitting still, those kinds of things are very difficult for them. You may see other kinds of behavior problems as suggested here: lying, stealing, fighting, again, disturbances in sleeping and eating, separation difficulties, that kind of thing. And finally, for the adolescent, this is the stage, of course, where identity is really beginning to develop. Kids in this age, as their body changes through puberty, are really very preoccupied with their bodily changes and all the new kinds of feelings that they're experiencing that they hadn't really experienced before. Increase in aggressive urges, but also sexual urges as well. Sometimes there's a struggle for independence from their parents. It refers to the reemergence of previous developmental issues and as being part of the normal experience for an adolescent. And I have often seen the adolescent experience of that struggle that sometimes will go on with authority figures in their lives, usually parents, seen it compared to the terrible twos. And in many respects, there's a lot of similarities here in that this, again, this sense of a struggle for independence from those that have been holding them back, so to speak, during these years. Now, it isn't necessarily the case that this is a conflict-ridden period of development, as some writers seem to suggest that it isn't out of the ordinary for that to happen, but it doesn't have to be that way. So sometimes parents worry if their kids are compliant and quiet and getting along, and that isn't necessarily a bad sign at all. It doesn't have to be a big struggle, but it is something that is much more common than perhaps at other stages of development. For those kids that are coming from violent environments, a lot of this stuff may be just exaggerated a great deal. So extra preoccupation with their body. There may be an exaggerated focus upon their sexuality, unsafe sex, drugs, alcohol, running away, identity confusion, feeling very inadequate, not being up to task, having difficulties in their relationship with their parents. Again, more than the norm. And may even be involved in dating violence as a victim or as an aggressor, somewhat depending upon the experiences they've had and the role models that they've had in their lives. And so, just in closing this discussion, as Peterson tells us, children are more aware of the issues in the home than their parents tend to realize. Even if they're too young to understand what's going on or why it's going on, they know that something isn't right. Don't convince yourself, if you're working with families and there is violence in the home, that the children aren't aware of what's going on, even if they're in the next room or even if they're away from the home for the night. This is an ongoing chronic situation and isn't something that is isolated to one episode. Kids know what's going on, and they worry more about their parents than their parents recognize. Sometimes they'll cope by avoiding problems or distracting themselves, and that can be through the substance abuse. It could be through cutting on themselves, other kinds of things as well. And they don't know where to go for help a lot of times, and they want age-appropriate information so that they can understand what's going on. And so this is one time when it's good that there's outreach, particularly with children in elementary school and into high school, middle school, and into high school. You start talking about dating violence and those kinds of things. It's a very good thing to put on those outreach programs and let kids know what is normal, what is not, and what they can, who they can turn to. It's best, in fact, if this can be worked into the curriculum at various stages in an age-appropriate fashion as well. Kids a lot of times see themselves as the peacemaker, and depending upon their age and place in the family, they take on roles and responsibilities that are necessary to help their parents. In families where there's domestic violence, the whole family will protect each other from the outside world. The whole family feels shame, and they all work to keep the issue secret many times. And so don't be surprised if kids are reluctant to talk about what's going on in their homes, because there's a message a lot of times that what goes on here doesn't go outside this environment. That has a lot to do with the isolation effect that abusers impose on homes. And so remember from an earlier lesson, we always want to ask our clients about violence in their lives and what they're exposed to. Give them an opportunity to tell you. They may not even volunteer after you ask, but once you've asked, you've opened that discussion, you've opened the door for the discussion, and later on they may feel safer to come back and tell you about it if they have more of a reason to trust you at the time. But begin asking about violence in their lives early in your relationship with your clients, adult and child. It is the responsibility of those in the helping professions to make children's lives better. That's all I have for this. I hope that there's useful information for you. As I mentioned, there's going to be a part 2 to this discussion in another 3 or 4 weeks. It'll be a ways away when we talk about batterers, because there's more connected to that. But we'll also be talking in that discussion about what to do about problem behaviors that kids present, and also how to help that child return to a normal life once the violence has been removed from their lives. Okay, thank you.